Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dharma and Justice Dialogue Series, hosted by the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism. My name is Peace Twessagy, and I'm the director of the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism, as well as Buddhism and Interreligious Engagement, where students are pursuing graduate degrees here, all within Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Today's conversation will be with Carla Jackson Brewer, Leslie Booker, and Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad, speaking about embodiment and sensuality in Buddhist traditions. Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad is visiting professor of Buddhism and Black Studies at Union Theological Seminary and author of Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition, the practice of stillness and movement for liberation, and a separate book, Racial Purity and Dangerous Bodies, Moral Pollution, Black Lives, and the Struggle for Justice. And Carla Jackson Brewer is a lecturer in the Women's and Gender Studies Department and the Africana Studies Department at Rutgers, the State University, where she teaches courses on dynamics of race, gender, and class, and African diasporic experience, and how gender occurs in numerous spiritual systems. She is the co-founder of Sine Qua Non, Allies in Healing, an integrative therapy practice in New York City. She has developed and offered many workshops and trainings for organizations that focus on race, gender, class, equity, and structural oppression, emotional intelligence, meditation, spirituality, and the sacred feminine. Carla is the co-chair of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council and is a senior teacher of Vajrayana Buddhism at Mandela, a Buddhist retreat center. She is an initiated priest in the West African spiritual system of Ifa. And Leslie Booker brings her heart and wisdom to the intersection of Dharma, embodied wisdom, and liberation. Using this framework, she supports folks in creating a culture of belonging through her teaching and writing on changing the paradigm of self and community care. She shares her offering widely as a university lecturer, public speaker, and Buddhist philosophy and meditation teacher. In 2020, she was a Sojourner Truth Leadership Fellow through Auburn Seminary and was voted by her peers as one of the 12 powerful women in the mindfulness movement. She currently lives in Philadelphia with her partner and pup and serves as the guiding teacher of New York Insight. So today's conversation will discuss this. In Buddhism, the body is the seat of practice, sometimes known as the vehicle for liberation on the path of Dharma. What does this mean in a tradition that emphasizes liberating the mind? What do Buddhist lineages teach with regards to sensual and sexual energies? So in this conversation, they'll explore questions of Buddhist doctrine and practices on liberation and the body. So before I hand over the mic, I would also like to say a quick thank you to the communications team who has helped bring this event to reality, and also the ASL interpreters here tonight. And so for those of you in Zoom, know that the Q&A box is open, so feel free to put questions there that might come up during the conversation. For those of you on Facebook and YouTube, we will definitely do our best to bring your questions into the space for the panelists to also see and respond to. Time will be reserved for responses to your questions in the later portion of our time together. So that is all from me, and now I'd like to pass the mic over to our panelists. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Peace, and thank you to our interpreters and to the union staff that have helped bring this event to fruition. And hello to my esteemed colleagues, Carla and Booker. It's so wonderful to be in your presence, if just on the screen. I wish we were in person. How I wish we were in person. But this will suffice in the meantime. It's so wonderful to see your beautiful, beautiful faces and just to feel your presence even from a distance. And what I would love in terms of getting started is for each of you to tell us a little bit about your lineage and what drew you to your lineages. Maybe Carla, do you want to get started?
Sure, I can start us off. I would like to start also by acknowledging where I'm located right now. I'm in New York City, and on the ancestral land of the Lenape people. Want to acknowledge their presence here and the connection to that land, and also being able to invite my ancestors into this conversation, because if not for them, I would not be here. So this feels really potent. And so my lineage is Vajrayana Buddhism, sometimes known as Tibetan Buddhism, Tantra. And it's interesting when you mention Tantra to people. I'll say in the West, but I'm looking for a new term. So if anybody has one, that would be good. They're like, oh my gosh, hot sex. And it's like, well, not necessarily so, right? But the Vajrayana path does have a way of embracing the senses and sensuality, because it is a path of Buddhism that in many ways takes every experience, every opportunity onto the path, so that all things can teach us, and really helps to cut through that dualistic thinking of good, bad, clean, unclean. And in its early development, certainly it was really, Tantra was challenging that. So that's my lineage. And within Vajrayana Buddhism, I practice mostly practices that are from the Nyingma school, early school of Tibetan Buddhism. And what drew me to this was actually this practice. So my teacher, Lama Tsultrim Ali Oni, at that time, around 1988, was creating these 10-day retreats where one would learn this really powerful practice dedicated to the divine feminine, to the queen of the Dakinis, Simamukha. And a friend of mine invited me, and when she called me up and said, I'm going to go do this, do you want to come? Even if you don't want to come, I'm going. I'm like, oh, I'll go. And I really didn't even know what I was going into, right? And then she sent me Lama's introduction to her book. And so I was introduced to these manifestations of the divine feminine that are wild and dynamic and moving between space. And I was like, oh, I want to experience that. And I have to say that 10-day retreat did in many ways rock my world and change my life. I have not had a practice previously, a spiritual practice, that really actually made a difference, not just in me, but in my environment, in people around me. And so this way of being able to, in this Dakini Mandala practice, to be with emotion, to transform emotion, to reframe the relationship with the body and the feminine, to feel actually empowered because, in Vajrayana yoga, in Vajrayana Buddhism, excuse me, there's, guru yoga, where you actually can manifest as Tara or Truma or, and that in and of itself does something. And so that gives you a little bit of a taste of what pulled me in, and also what's kept me here. Definitely. So thank you for that invitation.
For many years. Maybe you could tell us how many years you have practiced in this tradition.
Let's see, since 1988.
Yeah, a long
So
time.
a long, long time.
And Booker, you and I have had opportunity to have this conversation, a kind of toe in the water, and I could tell during Q&A how much people wanted so much more. And I wonder if you, being in a very different lineage of Buddhism, could tell us a little bit about that lineage and also what drew you to it.
Yeah, so my lineage is not as fun as Carla's lineage. I'm like,
It's not always fun.
I might have picked the wrong one. But I'm in the insight lineage, also known as, Western Theravada. And so we are from the Theravada lineage, Thera meaning the eldest. And so this is the lineage that is said to be the most direct lineage to the Buddha's teachings. Let's see, what else can I tell you about this lineage? What I love about this lineage is how accessible it is. It's very direct. It's all about suffering and the end of suffering, and it gives us a really clear framework of how to move with it. When I first came, what drew me to the practice was I was looking for a way out of suffering. I was an activist as a very young person, got burnt out very, very quickly. Without having support, without having a framework of practice, I very much burnt out, and then kind of ran away and joined the fashion industry in New York City, and just sort of like pushed all of that away, like it didn't matter anymore. And in working in the fashion industry, I was faced with suffering again. No matter how beautiful and rich and glamorous people were, there was so much suffering. And so as a wardrobe stylist, my job was to dress models. And I would often talk to them and say, what's going on? What's happening in your life? And I was like, there's so much suffering. And I wanted to understand what to do about that. And so I started dipping my toes in yoga. And I went to the New York Open Center for a little part-time job to kind of figure out how to get out of the fashion industry. And that's where I met Stan Greer, who was a very, very dear friend, mentor, kind of big brother type to me. And one day he said, I think that you should come to New York Insight and meet my teacher and just see what you think. And it was a potluck at New York Insight, the People of Color Sangha. And it was so beautiful and so warm. And it felt like that's who I want to be with. Those are the people I want to be with. And so I continued to go back, to that Sangha over and over again, eventually going on my first retreat. And I think I think that you were on the first retreat that I sat at IMS many years ago. And so it's my teacher, Gina Sharp, Larry Yang, and Bhante Buddharakita. So these beautiful teachers of color who had something to say about what was happening in the world, what was alive, and how we use our practice to meet the challenges and the heartache and the violence in the world that we are living in. And Bhante, who is a Ugandan monk, and I'd never seen a Black man in robes, never seen an African man in robes. And he was just complete and total joy. And I was like, whatever he's on, I want some of that, because that's what I wanted. And so it was really the community. We really focus on the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. And the Sangha absolutely is what kept me. these people are my dearest friends to this day, including Peace, including you. Um, and also at that time on the front page of the New York Insight website, it said Ehe Pasako, which means come and see for yourself.
Mm.
But it says, don't believe in doctrine, don't believe what your teachers say, go and have your own experience and then see how it works for you. And being someone who is incredibly rebellious, who hates rules, who wants to do things my way, it was this practice, a spiritual practice that gave me this beautiful community and also said, you don't have to believe what we say, like go and experience it, see if it works. And if it does, great, then come back for more.
Mm.
And it was just such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful entry into the Dhamma. And I feel very grateful that I came to it through a people of color Sangha. I think if I come through a dominant culture Sangha, it would have been a very different experience for me. So I'm really grateful for that entry.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense in so many ways. And I'm struck by how both of you have referenced the importance of elders and teachers in terms of bringing you in and helping you to anchor into your different lineages. And also just how, in a very kind of identifiable way, you are able to say, you know, this is what I needed. This is a way of being in the world that is captivating and also challenging, right? Like practice is hard. I think there's this vision that if we sit on the cushion and we have instructions, we will just arrive at this kind of, I don't know, eminently bountiful state of existence. And it's really just incredibly hard. And I wonder for both of you, and actually I'm really thinking of students a year ago in my class, the Dharma of James Baldwin and Audrey Lord, and how present they were with how Baldwin and Lord talked about sensuality and talked about various aspects of turning towards suffering, Booker, as you mentioned, and talk, especially Audrey Lord, about feminine energy and the importance of women's community. I wonder if, in some ways, that's really the origins of this conversation, is just the hunger my students had for this and really wanting to know how Buddhism, as this very broad 2,600-year-old tradition, how it speaks to sensual energy, how it speaks to various aspects of existence. And as you both have articulated so directly in very, very different ways, depending on what lineage you're in. And I wonder if for each of you, if there's a kind of doctrine or articulation that that you either have been offered. You've talked about Carla Dakinis and Booker, the how to work with suffering. Is there a teaching? Is there a practice? Is there something where you kind of enter into your practices and that becomes a kind of mainstay? For me, for example, it would be a compassion practice, like a depth of cultivating compassion first for myself and for others. And I wonder for each of you, what has been particularly meaningful?
Well, I think for me, because there are a number of aspects, right? In Vajrayana, there are many nature mind practices, which are so similar to really sitting, right? And resting in awareness and emptiness. That on one hand. And then for me, really, the other hand is mandala practice. So working the practices that work through the mandala, and in that circle with a center, we meet the deity in the center, or we meet with, in terms of the Dakini energy, the mandala of the 5 wisdom Dakinis. So here we have a moment where we can move around the mandala and experience the key wisdom of what are the 5 families, the 5 ways that wisdom may manifest, and the elements that are attached or associated with those. And then, of course, there are these, they refer to as the 5 poisons. It's interesting, Lama calls them the encumbered emotions, right? Ignorance, anger, pride, desire, and envy, all those human, like the human stuff. And to be able to just be with the human stuff and be in a practice that transforms that energy, that can liberate that energy, so that we're not being blocked or choked or and ultimately in this sort of working the mandala, coming back to recognizing our true nature, right? That we don't, this is not, it's not about these pieces, but that's been really such a powerful, skillful means for me in terms of working with the mandala energies, whether it's Dakini or working with the 5 Dhyani Buddhas or working with the Yabgyam, masculine and feminine expressions, or even with Tara practice. I was, just a little segue, I was teaching a class now at Union, which is so much fun, really. And they read Tara's enlightened activity, right? So really like teaching people about this divine feminine energy that is fierce. So compassion, but compassion that will go anywhere to liberate beings. And then like, okay, so am I willing to do that in my everyday life? And can I lean into some of that? That's the challenging aspect, right? How do we take our practice off the cushion?
Yeah.
How do I cut through my dualistic thinking? How do I like interrupt my judgment, right? Like, the little judging mind. So for me, actually, those 2 practice, mandala practice, because there's something that's so poignant and really smart about working with emotion and spirit and embodying spiritual energy, that I'm like, it just amazes me. And what amazes me is the impact that it has on me. And then also that I'm practicing not just for me, I'm practicing for the benefit of all sentient beings. And that, what does that really mean? So I think that those might be the practices. And again, if you're like working with desire, like for me, that kind of craving, sometimes it's like, I think about, I'm craving that best piece of lemon meringue pie that I had, and I could chase that taste through New York. Okay. It's like, and then be able to let's turn and work with this, the kind of suffering that then gets created because I can't get that taste back that one time. And that's like a simplistic example, but it really is. It's mind, body, spirit. I'm in this. So those are the things that I think about.
And Carla, can you tell us, because I actually don't know, because I have such little familiarity with your lineage, what is Tara practice? I've read a book on this, but I actually don't know the practice. I know 21 Taras.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there are. So most people are familiar with green Tara, right? And actually all of the Taras are sort of, blended in to her. So if you work with her, you can work with every one of the 21. Tara is a Buddha, actually, often referred to as a Bodhisattva. And I think some people know her story. Basically, she was given a choice. It's like, you're almost at enlightenment. If you die and come back as a man, you'll be enlightened and you can benefit a lot of folk. And she challenges these lamas and sort of says, really, what's male, what's female, relative realm, absolute realm doesn't exist. But you know what? I'm going to stay in the form of a female because beings may need that. And I'm going to be here to help swiftly anybody who just calls on me.
Mm.
I'm like, wow. And then when everybody is enlightened, it's sort of like I'll take my enlightened seat somewhere. My words. But so in Vajrayana practice, you might do a deity practice where you'd have, I'll call them introductory prayers, and then you work with the energy of Tara. So you might, many beings have a seed syllable, right? A sound that wakes them up or calls them. For Tara, it is Tam. And Tara is the expression of compassion. And so you would sound that seed syllable, and Vajrayana uses a lot of visualization. You visualize her in front of you, and you see that syllable in her heart, and you see a mantra spinning around it. So that's one way to engage. And then you might recite her mantra. So if it's green Tara, Om Tare Tu Tare Tore Swaha. Om Tare Tu Tare Tore Swaha. And you just, and that would be the focus or the gist, let us say, of your practice. And then she would dissolve, and you would have some closing prayers. So that would be a practice. And then the 21 Taras, each one has her own mantra and her own, as Lopan Chandra talks about in our community, her own superpower. So it's like there's a Tara for that. So that would be a kind of, deity practice. And there are different ways to do that, those kinds of practices. There are some where you actually sound the seed syllable and you arise as Tara. So you merge, and then you spin the mantra. And so then there's an embodied, energetic feeling of being this absolute wisdom being. Such that when you finish, really, one is not the same person. And I'll use this line, energetically, things have shifted.
That's so fascinating. I feel like I could keep listening and listening. I did take a workshop with you many years ago, but yes, Booker, I'm curious for you. I'm just a practice or a particular doctrine that's particularly meaningful for you.
Yeah, there's a few, and I love that compassion came in because that's also one of my practices. But I have to say, when I heard about Deepa Ma, she really woke things up for me. So Deepa Ma was a woman in Bangladesh in the 1950s, I believe, who was sort of dying of a broken heart. She had lost a few children, stillborn or children who had died very young. Her husband died very suddenly, and so she was very distraught. And her doctor recommended that she do meditation to keep herself from dying. And because she was a woman and because of the era she was in, her job was to stay home and to care for her daughter, whose name is Deepa. So Deepa Ma means mother of Deepa. And she really believed that women could be awakened, be enlightened beings by doing everyday household duties. And so I thought about her like stirring, I don't know, like a soup or something, and just like the sensuality of that, waking up through that movement, waking up through the aromas, waking up through the different textures. And so when I heard about that, like not going away on retreat, not studying, but just being in the body, being with the experiences of the body, I was so inspired by that kind of as Carla said earlier, and as I speak to often, like taking my practice off the cushion. What does it like to actually live my life off the cushion, which is a huge part of the way that I teach. Um, I taught in jails for over a decade in New York City. And so, having 13, 14-year-old boys being still and closing their eyes and meditating isn't really the way that it looks when you're teaching mindfulness in jails to young folks. And so we had to be really creative. And the thing about these teachings is that they're so universal. They are so universal that everyone could touch into um, that wanting to be free from the things that were imprisoning us. Even if it was literally a prison, we could still find ways to be liberated there.
Mm.
Um, the first foundation of mindfulness, which is from the Sutta, the Satipatthana Sutta, speaks about, embodiment. The body is the first foundation of mindfulness. And I was very intrigued by this because I was like, yeah, body's everything. Like everything you need to know can be found in the felt sense of the body and the way that we respond, like what we know in the breath. And so I was so excited that the body was the first foundation of mindfulness. But then I kind of learned that we use the body to anchor when we are looking at the mind states. We use the body as an anchor, not really working with the body as the actual thing that we are practicing with. It's something that we come back to when the mind gets too busy. So, so going back to the practice, that there's a lot I can say. I'm trying to like figure out, but the practice that really, really has been alive for me. There's a few of them. One is compassion. In our lineage, the Bodhisattva of compassion is Kuan Yin. And she is this two-spirit being who, again, was kind of given the option of being a Buddha, one who is awakened, one who never returns again, or being reborn into the body of this Bodhisattva who keeps being reborn and keeps helping people. And she chose to stay. And what I love about Kuan Yin is that she can be reborn as a child, as an animal, as a man or a woman, as any form that allows people to connect with compassion.
Mm.
And so her shape-shifting ability, I think, is so beautiful. And I love that. Compassion, as one of the four Brahma Viharas, these heart practices, it was how I came to understand compassion, how I came to be someone who was always looking for this practice. I saw folks experiencing homelessness for the first time when I was 9 years old, and I felt this quivering of the heart and this desire to move towards action. And that is the definition of compassion. So it feels like something that has been my sort of North Star my whole life. I suffered many years with reproductive issues. And when I went to South Africa to practice for a month, it was there that I spent a whole month studying and practicing compassion, doing the Great Compassion practice, up at 5 a.m., chanting, doing the Great Compassion, 2-hour ritual. And it was in that space that I began to have a more intimate relationship with my body. I was growing a lot of tumors in my body, my reproductive system, and they were the enemy, and I kept trying to push them away. And we always say everything's included, everything is welcome in our practice. And I was like, yeah, everything except for these, because they're trying to destroy me, So even myself, I was like, I can't get with that. But having a month to practice with dear friends, mostly women of color, once again, and really devoting that month to the practice of compassion, I was able to be in a more intimate relationship with my tumors, began to understand that they were not trying to destroy me. They couldn't stay, but that there was something that I could actually be in relationship with. And it allowed me to not see them as the enemy, but something that was a part of me, something that was the practice. And through the back door of compassion, I then found metta, I then found equanimity, upekkha. And so compassion really was like that heart that allows everything else to sort of grow up around it for me. And then, the precepts, these 5 ethical conducts, I love teaching on the precepts because in our lineage, we know them as this practice of asceticism, or this practice of abstinence. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And I was like, I get that we shouldn't kill, that we shouldn't steal, that, like, I get that, but also tell me that I can't do something makes me actually want to do it, or like challenge you, because that's just who I am. And it was, my dear friend Joanna Hardy that that kind of turned me on to more the cultivation practices of that. And so what we're doing is, first of all, starting with knowing how deeply our lives are intertwined. I undertake the practice to cultivate, protecting life, being generous, caring for my sexuality. I like to throw in power dynamic around that as well. Making sure that the speech that I'm using is speech that is harmonious, that brings people together, and that the intoxicants are not clouding my heart and mind and allowing me to be disconnected from other people. So it's not telling me what I'm not doing. It's saying, let's protect life so that we can be in deeper connection with each other. Let's care for our sexuality so that we can really care for and take care of each other. And I love the precepts because they're not a sexy, teaching. It's sort of like the 10 Commandments, but I think that they're so rich and really invite us in to explore what it is for ourselves. And I don't think that it's an accident that the Buddha or whoever ended up writing down these teachings, hundreds of years after the Buddha's death, that the precept around sexuality is in the middle of the 5 precepts, and it's sandwiched in between around generosity and speech. And so there's something about being generous in the way that we communicate that allows us to have really, ethical sexual experience. And so I think that's something really powerful in that, that I find just really, I don't know if anyone else has like made that connection, but I'm like, is it just me? But I think it's really interesting. I think that there's something powerful about that. Yeah, so that's pretty much, in our lineage, the doctrines around sexuality are pretty much, if you're a monastic, don't do it. And if you are a lay person, don't hurt people. That's kind of it. That's it. But I also think that there's something tied into like power dynamics as well. I think that whenever there's sexual misconduct, there's also like a power dynamic involved in there. So there's also some power struggles in there as well. Yeah. I mean, I love all of our practices. So it's really hard for me to be like, what's your favorite? But I think compassion, the practice around, working with emotions, especially anger, is like my most favorite emotion ever. And so really learning how to work with anger, not as an enemy, but to look at as an energy. It's fire element. It is an energy that is inviting us we feel it in our body. It's inviting us to move towards action. And so again, going back to the Satipatthana Sutta and that first foundation, being mindfulness of body, all of these practices keep coming back to the body. The quivering of the heart that leads us to action, that's compassion. The fire that we feel, that's anger. So for me, it just keeps coming back to the body over and over and over again. And if you don't have an intimate relationship with the body, I don't know how you know the rest of your practice. I hear so many people say, well, that's foundation. That's the first foundation. I want to do like the Dhammas. I want to do like the 4th foundation stuff. I'm like, but if you don't know how the body is speaking to you, why are we up in the mind? Like, it's the body that gives us information, that gives us wisdom.
Wow, that's so wise. You were able to draw together so much in that response. It's really, really profound. And
that's just a little ADHD. It's just the way that my brain works. It's like all over the place, but eventually we get back to,
I think there's a book in there. That's just my 2 cents as someone who loves to write. I think I think there's a book with many, many chapters to be elaborated in what
Yes.
you just said. And thankfully, this is being recorded, so you can go back and there you go. You have your chapters outlined. And I want to say, Booker, actually, you said so much that I was going to ask about. So in some ways, you've already answered my next question. But I do want to really kind of hone in on this coming back to the body. So dropping from the busy mind, coming back to the body. And I want to follow up, particularly because this lineage, which I'm also in, this doctrine of the elders lineage, highly, highly monastic with lots and lots of restraint, as you referred to, how you tie together a kind of sensual energy. And it sounds like give yourself permission to feel, if not act, in terms of relating to other people. And I don't know, Carla, because I don't know the Vajrayana lineage as well, if this is similar or different, but I do know in the Theravada tradition, as I know it in this particular context, as I have been brought into it, that we often don't tie together sensuality with the Theravada lineage. We don't have a kind of connection or straightforward understanding of how sensuality or sensual energy can be embraced. But it does sound like you've thought a lot about it, and also that you've worked a lot with that.
Just back to me.
Yeah, if we could just follow up and then jump to Carla.
Yeah. Early on, I started ballet when I was 3, started yoga in my 20s. And so I've always been a very embodied person. I've always been very sensitive to my intuition. And so I've always, for better or worse, I've had a very intimate relationship with my body. And so so no matter what I'm doing, the body is always going to take front. If I was a lawyer, I'm sure that my body would also play a part in the way that I practice law. And early on in my practice, going back to Sangha, I was very, very blessed to land at New York Insight with an amazing group of Black female yogis, including Darrell Williams and Sebene Selassie and Dalila Bothwell and Kate Johnson. Like, this is who I grew up with. And a couple of years into my practice. And I also started teaching yoga and mindfulness in jail. So I would listen to the Dharma from my teacher, but I would really listen to it through my body and to kind of pay attention to how my body was responding to it. And also how I could figure out how to teach Dharma as a yoga practice. And that was just my entry point into it, because it's the language that I understood was embodiment. And so that's how I learned about the Dharma. But very early on, 7A was like, let's talk about sensuality in the Dharma. And so we have these, it was like a secret group, which became not so very secret after a while.
What was it called? The conspiracy?
It was called and Peace is actually a part of it now. It's the Rogue Feminine Dharma Yin Conspiracy. Because the word conspiracy means to breathe together, to co-conspire, to breathe together. And so that was the name that we created for ourselves many years ago. And so we started reading Audrey Lord together, and we would talk about, this wasn't in our lineage, but we were like seeking out. And so as I began teaching early on in my practice, I would do a little bit, the Buddha said, but I was mainly like Audrey Lord said, Alice Walker said. So I was doing a lot of teaching through like the Black feminist lens, because there's a way that Black women speak and explain and express and write. It's so embodied, it's so sensual, like all the sense gates are open. And so to me, that was Dharma. That was Dharma. So I had to find it other places, but I could then tie it back in to what the Buddha said, or what I think the Buddha should have said, but he didn't. or what would be useful. to expand,
Right.
because, you know, we don't have the full story. We only have what was
Mhm.
written down 500 years after his death. I think he probably had more to say about it, but we don't know what was extracted, what was left in Asia, what our teachers, you know, the white teachers who brought it back, we don't, you know, they left a lot behind.
Hmm.
Um, and again, you know, with this lineage, it's like, see for yourself. Like, and there's also a very specific instruction to speak in the vernacular of the people that you're teaching so that they can understand. And so in working with vulnerable people who are experiencing, you know, homelessness, who are living with HIV and AIDS, who are incarcerated, who are living with addiction, I had to understand the Dharma in a way that was accessible and concrete and direct. And so speaking through this kind of like sensual lens, which, you know, and when I'm talking about essential, I'm talking about the sense gaze, opening up. How does it feel? How do you know? Tell me about how your gut feels. Like, teaching that way was a way that I had not seen a lot of most teachers teach, but it was a way that I knew how to teach.
Mhm.
And so, you know, grateful to all of these amazing, you know, Black feminist warrior authors who are out there with their beautiful words that just flowed so beautifully into the Dharma.
Yeah, Seb talks a good bit about Audrey Lord and all of this in her book. And I
Mhm.
think all of them are quoted in my book. I think I interviewed all of them. So I know how profound and how just I want to use this word, it's so academic, but constructive. And I include you in this, Booker, just how constructive your work is in terms of accessibility and being able to speak in a kind of vernacular and embody these teachings in a very particular, evident way.
Mm.
And Carla,
Yes.
I will just tell you, when I read Audre Lorde, I do think of her as a Dakini. I do think of her as having that wrathful, maternal, that compassionate, that sensual energy all at once, just in her writings. I mean, just seeing video of her, listening to her read her own poetry. And I just wonder for you, in terms of working with sensual energy and working with the body, you know, what really stands out to you in terms of your own lineage? You've mentioned so much already. I actually wrote about the manifesting of as Tara, but also you referred to this kind of image of Vajrayana. And I wonder if you can speak to your own kind of embodiment, your own working with this kind of sensual energy, or energies plural, if you will.
Yes, thank you. You know, as you were talking, Booker, I was thinking about, yeah, all right, so what's going on with the body, you know, in the Vajrayana lineage, right? And so, you know, Vajrayana really came out of householders wanting to practice, right? And people who might not have, you know, the right kind of work to do, you know, butchers and folks who ran the, I guess, the local saloon and arrow maker, you know, just regular folk who wanted to practice. And a lot of the early tantric practitioners were women. And so there was a sense of understanding the empowerment and a kind of sacredness in the body, either in a male form or a female form, but really respecting, right, this energy. And then, you know, these sexual, sensual images. So vulvas, you know, in tantric Buddhism, or if you look at some of the tankas, there are these sort of like, they're often very young looking, tiny waists, very round breasted deities that are sitting with their, you know, and their eyes are, their gaze is a certain way. It's very alluring. So it's almost as if the sensuality and sexuality is floating around in the air. And also, there are actual subtle body practices that one is working with the inner energy that then would include sexual exchange and sexual practice. But those are often secret, right? And it's not, like I say to people, it's not just about getting off, right? It really is. There's something deeper, more profound that could happen that is hard to describe, right? It's hard to describe, like when you're in compassion practice, how you feel or what the experience is. Right? It's like, oh, so we use language, but the language is so tied up with concepts, just a little cumbersome. I was thinking about what you're talking about, like raising bodhicitta. So in Vajrayana practice, before you set an intention, you raise bodhicitta, you connect with the heart mind, which is here, not here, right? And it's an awaken, right? So there's, for me, I often feel like a little opening or a little bubbling or a little warmth when I begin to raise that energy. And it may occur for people in other ways, but it's like being in the sense, and it feels like there's something that just opens as I'm dropping into practice. And on an energetic level, it's connecting me everywhere. So we have this practice. We have these very sexualized, sensualized images. There are some images where the deity is sitting and really the focus is her vulva. And so that's very present. What Vajrayana also does is that there is this, I'll call it a concept, a practice of one taste. And one taste doesn't mean that everything tastes the same, but it is a way of experiencing. And often this happens in a feast setting where you're eating food, and to really take the food in and just experience it. Try not to judge it. Like, I'm eating a strawberry. Oh, I'm not, oh, this is sweet. Oh, it's not as sweet as yesterday. Or just drop that and experience that, as you also experience a sour pickle or a bitter piece of escarole or a little piece of meat, even if you're not a meat eater. It's really like, be in it. And that's the, working with the senses. Vajrayana also works with the senses because things are colorful and decorated, and shrines of, are very elaborate, and there's sound. So not only mantra chanting sound, but instruments and drums and bells, and almost to, for some to get us out of a certain kind of habitual patterns and to be able to drop in. And so for me, I do think that Vajrayana practice, the practices that I've done, have actually helped me to drop from here into here. And I think there's a part of me that was in my body, but growing up in this culture, there's always like a little critique, oh, this is too fat, this is too round, too skinny. And then the dangers of being in a female body, like, ooh. And the dangers of being a Black woman, like, ooh. But like if working with Dakini and working with the Padma family, the Padma family is connected to, discernment in a wisdom sense, but in sensuality, sexuality, the relationship with other humans. And the enlightened activity of that family is magnetizing, right? But magnetizing with a kind of ethical element. So not magnetizing, like in relationship. It's like, oh, I like you, Rima. I really like you. You're my best friend. Let's just hang out. We're going to just hang out and play. And then I see book and I'm like, Booker, you're so interesting. You're so fascinating, right? And Reba's kind of like, Carla, do you want to have coffee? It's like, no, I don't really have time for coffee. But Booker, then I'm into, like, and I know people who do relationship because it's all about what it does for me, right? Kind of like the Facebook experience. How many likes did I get? I feel okay. But the kind of magnetizing energy that I think good teachers have, right? That with our intentions, we have a way of inviting people in and of opening up. It might even be, look at this, experience this, and then reflecting on that. So I think that, for me, working with that energy loosened things up, almost like gave me permission to allow the more wild side of me to be out there. And I'm a Virgo. I'm not but so wild, but it's sort of like it's kind of like, no, there is this, and I think it also connects to power. Like walking in the world with power and maybe self-sovereignty. So it's not power I'm gonna beat somebody up. But really pretty much I'm kind of in charge with what's going on over here. Right? And even like I like what's happening. I mean, I like that as a teacher, I can be kind of funny. I'm often, and I can be really irreverent, because sometimes the way Buddhism is presented in the West, it feels so tight. It's like, I can't teach tight. But learning to teach sitting down was really hard for me because all my university teaching, I'm standing up and walking around, but sitting, it was kind of like, so then my arms flail. But that I think is where, these practices really like have opened up, and yes, embodiment, sensuality. And I think also not being afraid of sexuality, right? And being aware, because of course in Vajrayana, like some other communities, there have been abuses. And, like it's important for us to recognize, to help all of us heal from that, and to really find a way. It's like, oh no, where is the crack that people could so easily fall into? And these patriarchal abuses of power, and then there are other kinds of abuses of power. So I think that there's something about working with sexuality in Vajrayana that definitely can lead to liberation. But you really, like, people have to really have done a lot of emotional work, my belief, because then it's just too easy to slip.
Yeah,
Like, how like when you're a teacher and people like, they just love you, right? They love you. And it's kind of like, oh boy, that could really like inflate the ego in a way that if there's no kind of check or balance or, more a compass, a North Star, you get swept away by that. And the emotional work in our traditions, and I hear that in your tradition also, your lineage, it kind of keeps us honest, bringing us back to the body, bringing us back to the center, bringing us back home.
I hear both
Buddha
of you
nature is
saying,
home.
yes, that actually, while we're talking about sensual energy and the body, working with the senses, giving ourselves permission to feel it all, including sexual energy, we're also fundamentally talking about ethics and ethical practice. I hear both of you honing in on that in very direct ways. And while that wasn't part of this event description, I appreciate so much that both of you have made that central to the way that you understand these practices of working with the body, of working with these central energies. And so often we say, in this particular context, we don't highlight ethics, but actually both of you have made ethics, very central to the ways in which these energies are embodied in your own lives and played out in terms of relationships with others. And that kind of self-awareness does have, both of you have said it beautifully, it does have ways of opening to greater freedoms, even if it's not immediately obvious, that if we have ethical practice at the core, we actually can open to these much greater practices of liberation, using sensual energies, using the body. So that's so wonderful. And I'm so glad that both of you have really, in your own ways, in your own lineages, and your own practices, that you've really honed in on that. And I see that we're at 8:02 and that we, I'm sure, have people who would like to ask questions. And so, Peace, I'm wondering, it looks like actually we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. But we, what is that a question, actually? We do have, this is actually someone who was very much an inspiration for this event, has put into the Q&A that she's a big fan of you, Carla. and that is something I hear routinely.
Well, thank you.
Yes,
That's
yes.
sweet.
Okay, Peace, do you want to read these questions out? What's a good way to proceed?
Yeah, so I'm happy to read some questions for you to take on. And yeah, thank you all so much for this conversation thus far. And I'll just start with a piece. One of these questions, one of the questions is, can you please also point out where in the scriptures there is writing about the divine feminine? So if you could speak to that. Thank you.
In the scriptures, well, I think we can, the one thing that comes to mind is the Prajnaparamita Sutra. And the Prajnaparamita Sutra actually, well, a sutra became an actual deity, Prajnaparamita, or Prajnaparamita, as people say it. The core of understanding the nature of phenomena and the nature of and our own minds. So that's one place. And then there are dharmas and sutras that come through the Vajrayana lineage that focus on the energies of, like, Yeshe Tsogyal, who was, I like to call her a partner of Guru Rinpoche and Mandarava, or Machik Lotran, who developed the Chip practice. So that's where we see the divine feminine. And then, of course, there is always Tara. And so, that's like a place to start. And, I'm sure that a person who's probably really, really good at knowing this would be someone like Miranda Shaw, who has done a lot of research on the sacred feminine, the divine feminine. Passion and Enlightenment was her first book. And then she has another book, Buddhist Goddesses in India. And she really is a scholar in terms of those kinds of texts. So she would be someone you might want to read, write to.
I actually used her quite a bit in my chapter on gender and sexuality, the same chapter you're quoted in, Carla, in my book. She's a wealth of information. Miranda Shaw.
Mm-hmm.
And the same person wrote another question, and I'm wondering, Peace, if we can bring this to Booker. This is the very first part of the Q&A. Because I think, Booker, you've actually done some thinking about this. What do you think, Peace?
Yes, feel free. Would you like me to address that part, or did you? I didn't know if you wanted to say more about it, Rima.
You guys are making it so mysterious now. Like,
Yeah,
what is
well, let me
what is the
just start.
Oh,
Yeah, so this person
Sorry
is
about
talking about, as a teacher, they've
Mm.
struggled not walking out because, and this is a woman who's saying this, because of the way that texts often describe the female body in extremely putrid terms. And
Yeah.
so when asked why, it's said, it's because it's addressing monks, and the orientation is for them to detach themselves from body and sensual pleasure. But
Yeah.
this has never sat well, with this person asking the question. So the question for you is, help me understand this with a bit more equity.
Yeah. Equity or equanimity, because that's I'm curious about that. Anyways, yeah, as Rima said, our lineage is very rooted in monastic culture. And so when we talk about the body, especially women's bodies, when women are mentioned in the suttas, they typically have a very tragic end, or something really horrible and tragic has happened to them that has led them to the Dharma. Um, yeah, one of like the deepest teachings on the body is on the 32 body parts, and pretty much it's this is a practice that we go through internally and externally, the 32 body parts, looking at skin and feces and sinew and feces and mucus, and it's meant to bring disenchantment of the body. Is meant to make the body something that we don't crave, that we don't want. And so the teachings in our lineage are all about dispassion. How do we make it ugly? How do we make it disgusting? How do we make it something that we don't want? How do we make it wrong? And my job as a teacher is to understand when and where that practice is useful. I've used that practice on long retreat, and it saved me. Like, it's been an incredibly powerful practice. But also having a practice that allows me to see the beauty in the world, to appreciate things that smell good, that look good, that taste good. Like, that allows my heart to stay open. And so when people take these teachings, again, that were, the Buddhist teachings, according to our lineage, were an oral tradition, through list, through chanting, through parables, through stories that were repeated and not written down anywhere from 100 to 500 years after the Buddha's death, and not actually in the language that the Buddha ever spoke. And so when people say that's not real Buddhism, that's not authentic, I'm like, Buddhism isn't authentic. Like, we don't know explicitly what the Buddha actually said. And so our job as teachers is to be able to take these teachings and to be able to utilize them in a skillful way. Yeah, and to not shut things down, but to really be open to conversation, to how people are experiencing it, and then finding a way to um, yeah, to make these teachings, I keep saying accessible, but yeah, available to people. We don't want people to feel shame, to feel disgust around their own body. And if that is what you're experiencing, maybe you should walk out on that teacher.
Mm.
I'm just saying, just because someone's sitting at the front of the room doesn't mean that they have the most skill in the room. And so I think that, yeah, again, I'm a bit of a disruptor. But but again, the Buddhist teaching is, we learn these, and how do we speak to them in a way that makes sense for who we're speaking to? And if a teacher can't translate it, and if they're kind of just saying, well, the Buddha said, then they haven't done their work. They're not actually in their practice.
Mm.
Thank you. This next question is looking to connect what you've been sharing about embodiment and sensuality to the earth. And so this person, well, I'll read most of it. It's first thanking you for this wonderful conversation and expressing gratitude. And so for this person, there's something about embodied sensuality that seems deeply related to the capacity to connect to the earth, to drop some of my human mental preoccupations, to drop into the animalness of my body, to feel the ways in which the earth is a being that I am in sensual reciprocal relation with. I'm curious if there are teachings or practices from your traditions that join body ethics and earth ethics.
I just love the person's intuition and
Mhm.
100%, you know, like
Mhm.
trust your intuition around that.
Mhm.
Um, I often say that our bodies are a microcosm of the natural world. And especially when I'm teaching, um, you know, on queer retreats or when I'm teaching folks who have um, an experience of disconnection from their body based on trauma, based on this part of my body doesn't really match my experience of who I am. I will often do guided meditation using um, the four elements as opposed to the body. So instead of using a body scan, to use the four elements. And I think it can be really useful because you think of like the earth element and the qualities of earth being rooted, grounded, there's a weightedness to it, there's a softness and also solidity. And so when we can tap into that knowing in our bodies, not only can we access the body in a way that feels a little bit away, so it feels safe enough to access that quality, that energy without being in the body. And it also allows us to have a deeper appreciation for the natural world. And so wind element can be you know, expansion, contraction, a rising, a falling. When I think of fire element, I think of digestive fires in our digestive system. You know, the heat and cold. Also, fire element as a catalyst towards systemic change that we're making in the world. And then, you know, water element is about cohesion. It's about a mind that collects, that comes together again, also allows there to be fluidity, you know, as we go from, you know, mindfulness of body to mindfulness of sound and back to body. There's a fluidity, there's a water element that allows that to move and to flow. I think that was all four of the elements, right? Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I often use that framework in when I know that people have trauma in their bodies, they feel like parts of their bodies don't belong to them. It's a really, really beautiful entryway. And it also, once you have that experience, you can't help but then be able to appreciate um, how perfectly imperfect you are and to see that as beauty. You know, when you're in nature, nothing is perfect. Everything's a little crooked. Everything's a little broken. Everything's a little like blemished. And when I can see the beauty in nature, I'm then able to reflect and say, oh, well, because I'm an extension of nature, that means that I am also beautiful.
Mm.
And so I really appreciate that person's intuition around like connection to nature. Yeah, thank you.
You know, as you were talking, Booker, I was thinking about in the Vajrayana lineage, the more advanced practice of Dzogchen, the great perfection, everything is perfect as it is.
Mm-hmm.
There are these integration with the element practices. So where you lie down on the earth and you just integrate with the earth, you know, like no concept, just really, and you might feel the grass and you might focus on the smells, etc. And with each element, you can have the experience of doing that, which is in some ways also breaking down this distinction of I'm here, Earth is there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
You know, that relationship. And so, you know, there are ways that in the lineages that this can be available and happen. And it really can help us think differently about our body. Not think, I don't want to say that, feel
Experience,
differently
yeah.
about our
Hmm.
bodies, you know, because it's a felt sense.
Yeah.
So I like that. Yeah.
Mm. And also, just in those of us who are part of the American culture, you know, our success is measured by how far we can get away from nature. And then, ironically, how much nature we can own. So it's a very
Mhm.
bizarre thing. You know, I think about like royal families, like being up on balconies and waving down to people, or people in high heels, or, you know, I often think about the Jeffersons because I love that show so much as a kid. And, you know, they talked about moving on up to the east side to a deluxe apartment in the sky. So also like going uptown, living in a penthouse, like again, being away from the earth. And so when we think about all these references in American culture, when you've made it, it's when you don't have dirty feet, right?
Mm.
It's like because you're elevated, you are away from the earth. You get to sleep in a high and lofty bed.
Mm.
And so there is something about having to undo what we've learned in our culture to have that relationship back with nature and our body again.
Mm. That's so beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions. One person was asking about, you know, the patriarchy and how you deal with emotions that come up with that as it shows up in these spaces. And then a different person asked this question. So this is a quote. Buddhism, well, let me tell you, this is a quote from Rita Gross in the book Buddhism After Patriarchy. So Buddhism, as it has manifested itself in history, is thoroughly and completely androcentric, though it is not especially misogynist, right? So that's the quote. How would Buddhism be different if there is a gynocentric perspective? Yeah, thank you.
I don't know what that word means. If someone could help me out with that word, that'd be awesome.
Kind of woman
Are you saying
centered.
are you saying gynocentric?
Yes.
I think that's what I heard.
Love it. Mm. Carla, you
Now I
want
want to
to?
know what you heard. Now I want to know
I
what
know.
you
I'm
heard.
like, what are we talking about? Okay. Carla, do you want to start with this
Oh,
one?
I don't, you know, it just feels like, oh, so what's coming up for me is the mother,
Yeah.
Mm.
right? The, you know, and there's, I can't even talk about, it's like richness, fullness. We'd have more of the female deities would be centered. That's what would pop up for me, you know. And the power that resides in that kind of gendered expression, and also not in what we might consider as a very, you know, sort of tight gendered expression. I think that if that were happening, then women in many cultures would have more power, would have more safety. And not just in cultures far away, right here in the US of A. I it's interesting that I just keep seeing this like opening, this like welcoming, this like heart. And
Is it a vulva that you're seeing?
probably
That's a great question.
hey, I'm working my way there. but yeah, I mean, think about it. It's like, oh, if Buddhism, and like people wouldn't have to be ashamed of the
Yeah.
vulva. We wouldn't have to hide it. We wouldn't have to wash it with 9,000 things. We wouldn't have to, and it can look how it looks, and it'll change how it changes, right? As we age, it's like, oh, there's some things happening. Look, it's a little different, right? So it just feels like, it would be a whole different world.
Yeah. I think that I remember, I trained at Spirit Rock for 10 years altogether in 3 different trainings. And I remember there was a woman in one of my trainings who had a small child at home, and her kid was probably around 7 at the time. And she lived about 10 minutes from Spirit Rock. And she said, I'm happy to be in this training, but I'm going to have to go home and tuck my kid in. Like, she's 7 years old. And I remember it being a thing. It's like, you're either in the training or you're there. You can't be both. You can't do both. And I'm like they would never tell a man you have to drop being, well, also I don't want to be so gendered and stereotypical, but it's, I mean, should I just go there? I don't know. I'll just go there. But, men are expected to leave the family behind and go off and do whatever they do. And women are meant to be the caregiver. So if this woman who's a caregiver also wants to pursue, spiritual practice, it was a problem. It was a problem, which I found unbelievable in this, the century that we're in, and that is still what we were talking about. If there, and I also say, if there was a more, gynocentric Dharma, I think that the teachings would be more accessible. I think that the way that a lot of my male counterparts teach are so in the head, they're so cerebral. And oftentimes, the body is just what gets the brain to the cushion. So I think we would actually have a much more intimate relationship with the body. And I love wearing red lipstick when I teach. It makes me feel empowered, and it brings joy to me. And I remember it was commented, and I was wearing a much more, I have this is my Zoom red. I also have a retreat red, which is much more subtle. And it was commented about me wearing lipstick to teach. And I was like, this has nothing to do with the Dharma. This has nothing to do with the Dharma. And so things like that are just, people could have children and also be in the Dharma. You see a lot more children on retreat. In my lineage, we don't, we have 1 family retreat a year. Children are never to be seen or heard at a retreat center. If you are a student in a training, you have to bring a nanny with you, and you have to stay off campus if you're still nursing your child. It's really, we have not figured out how to take care of people who are actively parenting while teaching in the Dharma.
So true. So true.
Yeah. So people say, I'll see you in 10 years when they have children. I've had many friends say, I'll see you in 10 years when I'm able to go on retreat again.
Yeah.
Just to follow up a little bit, I think even in terms of practice, right? There would be teachers who would be more understanding of the creative ways that one must learn to meditate or practice with children around. My practice was regularly disrupted. And to accommodate that without the frustration response or feeling like I'm not doing it good enough. I can only drop in a little bit. It's we're doing it fine, right? And so there would be a real understanding and accommodation, And we might not be so caught up, in Vajrayana sometimes is this whole accumulation of practices and mantras, and so you can get to the next level. And there might not be so much stress on that, right? That might be a real difference.
It wouldn't be as precious. It's like, of course you get interrupted. Of course. That's literally the practice. And then you come back again. That's literally the practice.
And you learn how to work with it.
And yeah.
Truly.
Yep.
Yes.
It would just be better. It would just be better is the bottom line to that response to that question.
Yeah.
Maybe we have time for one more question.
Wonderful. All right. Yeah, gratitude is still coming in. So this question is, could you speak specifically and concretely about what it looks like potentially to liberate through the doorway of sexuality? Yeah, this was initially in response to a comment Carla made, but they're open to all responses, from Booker as well.
Because the practices in Vajrayana that are connected to that kind of liberation they are held secret. And they're not held secret because, they're being kept away. But in some ways, it really is kind of to protect one from what could possibly go wrong in practicing in that way. So there's lots of preparation that happens in terms of practicing to then be able to, almost like, it's like preparing the body's nervous system to be able to run, work with, experience, I guess, for lack of a better term, the energy that could manifest in those practices. Vajrayana practices are really powerful because they're working with our nervous systems and our subtle bodies. And so that's why it's so important to have a teacher and a Sangha to help create a container for this kind of liberatory practice. And I just want to I always like to remind myself, and like, one can achieve liberation in so many ways, right? Right? And like in Vajrayana, it's like at any moment, there's a possibility that you could. So although practices sometimes are set up in like kind of a hierarchy, that's just really different folks have different capacities, and they go through door number 1 as opposed to door number 2, but they all lead to recognizing our Buddha nature, right? So that may not be the best answer to the question, but really, there isn't, some of these practices, you have to get empowerment. You need to, it's as if you get permission, in a sense. Probably not a good way to phrase it, to do this practice. It's like you're ready. It's like, so like you wouldn't jump off the high dive if you've never dove into a pool before. I mean, you might, but you could hurt yourself, right? So you might want to start with a lower dive and work your way. I mean, that's how I think about that question.
And in a kind of like, tonight when I go to bed with my partner, what does it look like? I will say, again, going back to the precepts, because that precept around sexuality, caring for your sexuality, is in between generosity and speech. I want to give like a big shout out to people who are non-monogamous relationships, folks who are polyamorous, people who are in open relationships, because there's so much communication and honesty and directness, which I don't find in typical heteronormative relationships. And so that is one way that you can really utilize your practice, and to engage with your partner too, to have that really, really clear communication, to be generous with your partner about what you need, what you don't need. So that's just one like really concrete way that I utilize the precepts to awaken through sexuality. And when you have that, it's so liberating, because we're told for some reason to like be a little bit secretive, a little bit mysterious, and not, and like that isn't serving anyone. And so I really do, I've really enjoyed those times in my life when I've had that kind of like communication and relationships.
Mm. Thank you both, dear sisters. We have a note in the Q&A, and I'm going to read it out loud because it expresses what I feel, and I think also expresses what other people who have joined us this evening feel. And it is this: this conversation has been a homecoming. I could weep with the overflow of joy that fills my heart. Thank you for this luminous offering. With those words, so much gratitude to both of you, dear sisters, to Peace, to our ASL interpreters. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this evening. We're so grateful for your presence.
Thanks, Rima.
Yes, thank
You're
you.
the best.
Shared joy, shared gratitude.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.